On the morning of February 3rd, 1943, as the frozen smoke still hung over the ruins of Stalingrad, a shocking truth slowly settled into the minds of German commanders across the Eastern Front. The Sixth Army was gone, not retreating, not regrouping, gone. And yet, something far worse was unfolding. The Red Army was not stopping. It was still moving west. For many German generals, this was the moment when confidence cracked, when private words became darker than anything ever said in public, and when the war in the East suddenly felt unwinnable for the first time. Just weeks earlier, Adolf Hitler had promised that Stalingrad would be held to the last man. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had obeyed, even after being promoted on January 30th, 1943, a clear signal that he was expected to die rather than surrender. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. When Paulus surrendered on February 2nd, it shocked the entire German High Command. But what truly terrified the generals was not the surrender itself, it was what came next. Soviet radio intercepts, frontline reports, and aerial reconnaissance all showed the same thing. The Red Army was launching new offensives almost immediately. Exhausted Soviet troops were not collapsing as expected, they were advancing. At Army Group South headquarters near Zaporizhzhia, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein read the first situation reports in silence. Officers later recalled that he did not raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he leaned over the map and quietly said that the Soviets were no longer fighting like a beaten force. He noted that entire Soviet tank armies were appearing where German intelligence believed nothing remained. For Manstein, Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was proof that the Red Army had learned how to destroy German armies and then exploit the victory without pause. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff in Berlin, reacted with visible strain. By early February, Zeitzler was already physically exhausted from months of arguing with Hitler over supply limits and retreat permissions. After Stalingrad, he reportedly told colleagues that the Eastern Front no longer had a solid line. What worried him most was not the loss of men, but the loss of time. He understood that the Red Army was now faster in planning and movement. The Germans were reacting instead of controlling events. That shift alone changed everything. On February 5, 1943, reports arrived that Soviet forces had retaken Kursk and Belgorod. These cities were not symbolic ruins like Stalingrad. They were operational hubs, rail junctions, gateways into Ukraine. When General Hermann Hoth, commander of 4th Panzer Army, saw these updates, he reportedly said that the Soviets were striking deep, not wide. This was a professional observation, not panic. He meant that the Red Army was no longer wasting strength on frontal assaults. They were aiming at German balance, supply and command structure. That realization spread quietly among senior officers. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured warfare, was not on active field command at that moment, but his influence was still strong. In private conversations later recalled by staff officers, Guderian said Stalingrad showed that Germany had lost the war of movement in the East. He believed the Soviets now understood how to absorb losses and still maintain operational momentum. To Guderian, the fact that Soviet tank formations were advancing in winter conditions, across broken terrain, meant Germany no longer held a technical advantage. At Army Group Center, stationed near Smolensk, Colonel General Günther von Kluge was deeply alarmed by what he saw in February and March 1943. His sector had not collapsed yet, but Soviet pressure was increasing daily. When briefed on Soviet troop concentrations, Kluge reportedly asked whether these units had come from reserves or from the Stalingrad front itself. When told many were the same formations, rebuilt and rearmed, he remarked that the Soviets were regenerating strength faster than Germany could destroy it. That statement was not meant for morale. It was a cold assessment. In East Prussia, far from the front, senior officers at OKH began to whisper doubts that would never be written down. One officer later recalled that Stalingrad broke the spell of inevitability. Before February 1943, defeat was considered possible, but unlikely. After Stalingrad, victory was still spoken of publicly, but privately many generals began to ask how long Germany could survive. The fact that the Red Army kept advancing made retreat no longer a choice, but a constant necessity. By mid-February, Soviet Operation Star and Operation Gallop were in full motion. Kharkov fell on February 16th. This was a massive psychological blow. Field Marshal Manstein had warned that holding Kharkov without proper reserves was dangerous, but Hitler insisted on standing firm. When the city was lost, Manstein reportedly said that the Red Army was now dictating the rhythm of the war. He did not say this to Hitler. He said it to his staff, men who understood what it meant. It meant Germany was no longer setting conditions. It was reacting under pressure. General Erich von Kluge, commanding Army Group A in the Caucasus, had already conducted a difficult withdrawal earlier in January. When he learned that Soviet forces were pushing toward the Dnieper River, he remarked that Stalingrad had turned every German retreat into a chase. The Red Army no longer paused to consolidate. They pursued immediately. This forced German units to abandon equipment, shorten defensive lines, and rely on improvisation. For a professional army built on planning, this was deeply unsettling. Perhaps the most revealing reactions came not from speeches, but from changes in behaviour. After Stalingrad, German generals began requesting permission to retreat far earlier than before. They began speaking more openly about manpower shortages. They started emphasising defence, in depth instead of counterattack. These were not words of defeat, but they were signs of adjustment. The Red Army had changed the rules, and the Germans knew it. On March 1st, 1943, at a conference with senior commanders, Hitler raged about betrayal and weakness. He insisted that Stalingrad was an exception, but many generals listening understood that exceptions do not create patterns. The Soviet advance across southern Russia was not slowing. Rail lines were being cut. Airfields were being overrun. Entire divisions were being forced back hundreds of kilometres. No amount of speeches could hide that reality. Manstein would later launch a counterstroke and retake Kharkov in March 1943, a brilliant operational success. But even then, he reportedly warned that such victories were temporary. The Red Army had depth now. Losing ground no longer meant collapse for them. They could afford setbacks. Germany could not. This difference shaped every conversation among senior officers going forward. General Walter Model, known for his defensive skill, observed that Soviet commanders were becoming more flexible. They adjusted plans mid-operation. They exploited weak points faster. Model was not impressed easily. When he said the enemy was improving, other generals listened. His concern was not fear. It was respect. And respect for the enemy was something German generals had rarely expressed before 1943. As spring turned into summer and preparations began for what would become the Battle of Kursk, the shadow of Stalingrad loomed over every map table. German generals no longer asked whether the Red Army would attack. They asked where and how soon. The memory of Soviet forces advancing immediately after their greatest loss stayed fresh. It reminded them that the war had entered a new phase. Stalingrad was supposed to break the Soviet Union. Instead, it hardened it. And when German generals watched Soviet columns move west through the snow, rebuilding bridges, repairing railways, and pushing forward without pause, many of them understood a simple truth. The enemy they had underestimated was gone. In its place stood an army that could lose a city, lose an army, and still come back stronger. By the end of 1943, several German generals would admit in private that Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. Not because of the surrender itself, but because the Red Army never gave them time to recover. It kept advancing. And in war, momentum is everything. What German generals said after Stalingrad was rarely written in official reports. It was spoken quietly, in map rooms, late at night, over cold coffee and fading confidence. They said the Soviets were learning faster. They said Germany was running out of options. And above all, they said that the war in the East would never again be the same. Because once they saw the Red Army still advancing after Stalingrad, they knew something irreversible had happened. The balance had shifted, and no amount of orders, promotions or speeches could shift it back. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.